comics have changed a lot over the 30 years that I've been a collector. And I thought it would be fun to start up a series where I talk about what brought about some of those changes along with the pros and cons that have come along with each one of them. And I thought I would start out by talking about how comics overall, now I'm speaking in generalizations, so there'll always be exceptions, so I don't want anybody saying, well, Amazing Spider-Man number 30 did this. But overall, comics today have much less text in them than they did 30 years ago. So what brought about this change? Well, there are a number of factors, beginning with the shift from comics being sold primarily on the newsstand to being sold on the direct market through LCSs or online orders and so forth. And this shift led to a focus on a different target audience. Whereas when comics were sold primarily on the newsstand, publishers were especially focused on capturing the attention of new readers. Of course, their hope was that little Johnny would be walking through 7-Eleven and he'd see this cool Iron Man cover and he'd begin to tug on his mom's shirt and say, Mommy, this book looks really neat. Will you buy it for me? And so publishers knew that if this was what was going to happen, then this issue would be a lot of people's first story that they ever read. And because it was going to be their first story, they knew that there needed to be a lot of explanation to the story. So in other words, little Johnny opens up his Iron Man and all of a sudden he sees a battle against the Mandarin and he's like, who is this character? And so then the writer has to say, the Mandarin with 10 rings. The first ring does this, the second ring does this, the third ring does this. And every time you open up an issue of Iron Man with a Mandarin, there's that exposition again. All of a sudden, Pepper Potts comes into the picture. Oh, Pepper Potts, who used to be a longtime girlfriend of Tony Stark. And you've got to have all this explanation to these new readers. But when comics began to be marketed primarily towards established readers in the direct market, then all of a sudden you had less need for this exposition because the assumption is this reader's already going to know who the Mandarin is. So you don't have to describe every ring every single time. Now, of course, publishers still want new readers to come in, obviously, but their primary focus is on satisfying and maintaining current readers. And those readers simply need less explanation, along with the fact that, once again, the target audience shifted to a older target audience who has more maybe disposable income. Perhaps that's part of the shift of the reasoning behind that. But the older audience, again, needs less explanation than a kid does. You 5-year-old Johnny, he sees all these rings like, I don't get it. And the publisher has to explain those rings to the kid, really wants to make sure the children get it, what these rings are all about, where an adult might not need as much explanation. Also, the advent of the internet led to less need for exposition in comic books. Because even if you're a new reader, you open it up, all of a sudden you see this character, the Mandarin, and his rings are doing all these crazy things, and you're confused, and you don't know what it's all about. Well, you can just Google the Mandarin, or look it up on Wikipedia or whatever, and you don't need the comic itself to tell you so much, because so much information is readily available on the internet. Whereas 30 years ago, when I first started collecting, the only chance I had to know what this Mandarin character was all about was if it was in the comic book itself. I didn't have other resources to go to. And now, of course, there's almost unlimited information about every character on the internet. Even the most obscure characters will often have some wiki dedicated to telling about who they are, every comic they've ever appeared in. I mean, it's really awesome to be a comic fan today and to have access to all that information about all those characters for free. I mean, I remember back in the day, occasionally you would get these handbooks where it had a profile on a character and you had to pay for them, and it would only have 12 characters in each issue. But now all of a sudden we have Wikipedia that gives us all that access for, again, absolutely free, right at our fingertips at all times. If I want to know about the Mandarin, just in my pocket, I can pull this out and find out all about him. It's awesome how the internet has enhanced our ability to know and enjoy these characters. Now, I think another reason the internet has led to a reduction of text in comic books is because the fact that we, zoom from website to website, video to video, increasingly so with things like TikTok, you have these real quick videos. Even YouTube obviously provides some short form content, has led to a lower attention span where people are less interested in reading and more learn, especially through visual cues. And so, you're watching this video here, right? There's absolutely no text that's on the screen right now, and hopefully you're learning something. But we are increasingly more visually wired, and so I think comic books have understood that, and they are now trying to appeal to us visually. And this visual appeal was also influenced by manga, which has this form of storytelling called decompression, which relies more on visual storytelling rather than text. And the comic book industry has been really impacted by that form of decompression. And that emphasis on visual storytelling may have been embraced by the comic book industry for a couple of other reasons. And this right here is speculative, but I think this may have intentionally or unintentionally been the case. But decompression leads to a drawn out storyline. You're really trying to communicate through visuals rather than text. And so the story moves slower. Well, if you're a writer who gets paid by the page and you've got this idea for a story and you can stretch it over 2 comic books or 3 comic books rather than 1, well, all of a sudden you're going to get paid 2 to 3 times more for your story. Now, I don't know if that's been the case, but it's just something that I think could have happened, along with the embracement of trade paperbacks. Because with the embracement of trade paperbacks, all of a sudden you didn't have standalone issues much anymore, but you have almost every storyline is like 6 issues, right? So they go straight into a trade paperback. And so if you're a writer and man, I've got to write to this 6-issue storyline, but the story I have in mind really is a 3-issue story. Well, the way that you can draw it out to be able to format into that trade paperback is rely on a lot more visual storytelling. And so stretch again it out over many panels through the art. And this brings me to what I think is the biggest pro in this change, is that there's been a greater emphasis on art. And if you're a person who really enjoys visuals, and especially I think that is increasingly the case as we are, again, taking in more and more information visually than through simply reading text. People aren't really reading newspapers anymore or magazines. Even when we're reading things online, it's usually accompanied by some type of picture. But obviously, we're especially consuming media this way, where it's just visual. If you're someone who likes visuals, then this greater emphasis on art is a wonderful thing. Second pro with this approach is that it keeps comics from being as much of a slog. Sometimes when I was reading back in the day, you would just be slogging through an issue. There was so much exposition, especially, again, if you were a regular reader and you're like, okay, how many times do I need Mandarin's rings explained to me, or whatever it might be. And so this new approach of less text can simplify things, can minimize things, so that it's easier to get through. Now, that brings me to the downside of this shift in the industry, which of course is that you do just get less story. Even though personally I had to slog through some books, and maybe this is just the Gen X in me, or maybe some of you boomers, some of us old guys can relate to this. I want a lot of story. It really makes it exciting. I want a comic to take me 20 to 30 minutes to get through rather than 5 minutes. And I know a lot of people in my generation, I was reading some forums earlier to kind of prepare for this. A lot of people feel like they're being ripped off now because not only obviously are we paying more for comic books, which inflation obviously plays a role in that, but those of us especially who like to read, feel like we're getting less value for our money. We feel like, oh man, what used to provide me with 20 to 30 minutes of entertainment now is only providing me with 5 minutes of entertainment, and we get really frustrated by that. And I'm really curious if that is an older generation versus younger generation thing. I think it probably is. And in the comments, I'm curious, put your age and tell me, do you prefer more visual storytelling or more expositional storytelling? And obviously it's going to be a small sample size, but it'd be pretty cool to see what people tend to think along generational lines. Now, another con with the embracement of decompression storytelling, this visual drawn out storytelling, is that again, the story just moves much more slowly. And for someone like me, and it might be a generational thing, that can be frustrating. I really want to see the story move along, and it seemed like just so much more things happened when I was reading comics 30 years ago. But once again, you tell me, do you prefer comics from 30 years ago with all its text and exposition and cramming 9 panels on a page, but you got a ton of story? Or do you prefer the comics of today where you have much more emphasis on visuals and these beautiful art pieces? Again, not to say that art wasn't important 30 years ago, and not to say that story isn't important today. Obviously, we're just talking about trends and generalities and the differences, but do you like today's comics with these greater emphasis on art pieces? I'm super curious to know, so please tell me. And I'm also interested in what other changes you've noticed that have happened in comics over the past 30 years. Tell me that in the comments below, and I'll take some of those and look to use those changes for future videos in this series. Of course, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, I'd appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Like, comment, thank you.